have unlocked the eternal link to internal source, the key of imagination, your admission, access to the enlightened dimension. A gateway at the junction of darkness and light, the place at which the chaos of our conditioned frame of mind give way to a life in constant flux, only to be mastered through vigilant discipline. Peaceful times may come, testing times may go. This is the ebb and flow.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Ebb and Flow podcast. I'm your host, Eben Britton. I hope you guys are hanging tough out there during these strange times we find ourselves in. Very excited for the conversation today with, I don't even know how to begin, Dr. Ted Achacoso. Welcome to the show, my brother.
Thank you.
Absolutely, man. So, for starters, when Shakar, is that your emissary? Shakar Pai?
Yes, he's an MD actually, graduated from Georgetown. He's one of my students.
Oh, amazing!
And who's made it his life's career to pour me out.
I love that. No, I love it. Hey, we all need that.
I don't even know who I'm gonna talk to next or when. It's just like, Dr. Ted, you have an interview with Eben. I said, let me see who he is and why.
I love it. No, it's awesome. Well, I think that he believes you have a lot of really important information to download to the world, man.
Yeah, my whole point, Eben, is about how do we diminish human suffering, right? How do we diminish? And in fact, my company, Smarter Not Harder Inc., the makers of prescription, the blue carnitine that you bought.
Yes.
You know, the mission of that is actually closer to my personal mission, which is, you know, how do I decrease suffering in myself, and how do I decrease suffering in the world, in others, you know, knowing that there are no others, you know, so the other person is you, right?
I love it.
And how do we foster a community of what I call non-reciprocal altruism, right? Because in altruism, you know, which is defined in terms of biology, in kinship selection, I'll be nice to my blood brothers first, you know, before I will be nice to my community, before I will be nice to the world, right? I'm nice to my species first before I will be nice to other species, right? So how do you upend that, you know, because reciprocal altruism is built into our genes, right? It's allowed for our survival and reproduction, but non-reciprocal altruism isn't, right? So these are the kinds of things that have bothered me. In fact, for a long time, I've done my research primarily in the computation of consciousness. I think you've heard that very early on. I was using neural networks to model how the brain works. But more importantly, in terms of tying this together with the Eastern traditions and neuroscience, right? And in the end, by the end of the day, I'm still a scientist at heart. And what has progressed from before to now is that we have found the seat of self, right? We have found the seat of the egoic self in the brain, and it's called the default mode network, right? And it's an illusion, right? It's an illusion. It just comes about from the processing of the brain. Fortunately, we become identified with that. Therefore, you know, you find people who are depressed or anxious with lots of self-ruminative thoughts, right? That bring them down. That's coming in from that. So I hate to call it ego because people seem to misunderstand what ego is. It's like it's something negative, right? It's a Freudian term. So which means to most people you're sense of self-importance, right? But it
Uh-huh.
isn't from where I'm using it. I'm using it as the self-referential system for which you form your autobiographical narratives, right?
Yes.
And the thing is, the reason why I call it an illusion, and in neuroscience already shows that it's an illusion, right? It's as if, it's not, being an illusion doesn't mean it isn't there. It's
Mm.
only as if it's there, right?
Uh-huh.
So an illusion is different from being not there. Okay.
Yeah.
And the big reason why I focus on this early on is that it's the self-referential system that likes owning stuff, right?
Yeah.
It's like, remember pain is inevitable but suffering is optional.
I love that
The
quote.
pain will, the pain will come, but who is it that's suffering? It's
Mm-hmm.
the self-referential system, the ego itself. It's because it owns the experience. That's why it's called an experience collector, right? It
Mm.
likes to own experiences. So I am the one owning, I own the seeing, I own the hearing, I
Mm.
own the judgments, I own these
Yes.
feelings. Whereas, I've listened to a few of your podcasts in my race to come here, is that, what meditation teaches you, or what psychedelics teach you, is to be able to see that the self just arises from fundamental awareness or consciousness.
Mm.
And that's what you mean by a non-dual type of practice. So dual type of practice is when you focus on your breath, you focus on your thoughts, emotions, etc. So there's attention that's jumping from place to place. But if you're familiar with Sam Harris's work in
Yep.
the Waking Up app, he has a short lesson in there that says you can't get there from here, where where he explains a map of New York, and someone saying, no, you can't get to Central Park using this map. And that's because that map is actually provided by your egoic self, right?
Uh-huh.
So you can't get into I don't know why people regard enlightenment as, so with a lot of spiritual and other things wrapped up to it.
Mm-hmm.
If you come to think of it in neuroscientific terms, is just being able to see the ego or the self-referential system as it arises. And this is a skill that can be taught, right? It can be taught in meditation. It can be taught in mindfulness, and so on. And the other thing is that the important thing to know is that self-referential system is actually counter-wired with what's called the task-positive network, or the network that's responsible for you to be in a flow state. Like, for example, when I used to do surgery, I would get engrossed in that state, right? There's no ego there because it's focused out. And when you're focused outward, right, the default mode network switches off. Okay.
Mm.
And it's that off switch that actually is turned off by LSD, for example,
Mm.
during LSD trip or during a psilocybin trip, right? If you look at the work of Robin Carhart Harris, rather, where he shows the picture of the activity of the brain when the egoic self is there, or the self-referential system is there. It serves like a conductor. It only brings into awareness what you need to see, right? But when it's dampened, you see all the other areas of the brain actually communicating with each other that don't normally communicate with each other. So
That's so fascinating.
So for me, the role of psychedelics here is for you to be able to experience at least once, what it is to have no self-referential system at all, right?
Yeah.
And for me, there's as I said, you can call it a spiritual practice or anything like that, but sticking to the science of it, it's essentially an awareness of when the self is arising, right? Because it's the self that suffers.
Yes.
And so when it arises, you begin to, like, these emotions are you, right? You become identified with it. In fact,
Yes.
when your attention is hijacked by your thoughts and emotions, you're fucked, man.
Yeah.
Because then
Totally.
that tunnels you into that system. So what are we looking at now? So it turns out that the task positive network, actually the two main nodes of those are the sides of the brain. If you like to consider them as the sides of the brain, there's what's called the salience network and the central executive network. Now the salience network is considered as the switch. It's the one that's switching you back and forth from your default mode to your central executive and back. And this is this has been possible only because we have been able to now map the large tracts of the brain. As I said, I'm after neural connections, right? You're
Right.
able to map the large tracts of the brain, which we were not able to do in the 1990s, right? So when you're looking at brain structures now, it's useless to just know the anatomy. You should also know what the connections are. In fact, there are now textbooks or entire encyclopedias that are devoted to how the brain is wired, even just grossly wired, right? So we know that for example, the brain, the 3D printing of the brain in the embryo, as I like to call it, the brain is 3D printed in the embryo. The uterus is a 3D printing machine, and
Wow.
so
Yeah.
most listeners will probably have seen this somewhere. That, for example, the skin and the brain are derived from the same layer of cells, right? So basically your skin is your external sense, and
It's
your
a
brain
giant
is your
brain.
internal sense.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's an internal sensor. So when you're looking at the 3D printing, the first things that get printed by evolution, and you could see this being recapitulated by the brain, right? Is your autonomic nervous system. These are the things that make you survive. Your what do you call your reticular activating system? The things that wake you up from a coma, for example. You see that's the brain stem. Right? That's where your breathing happens. That's where your heartbeat happens, and so on. These are things that you have no control of, right? And so if you look at animals, other animals, all they have is an autonomic nervous system, and you could see this in infants too. Right? You can see this in infants during their development, that when they're born, they're just full of reflexes. Rooting reflex, when you place something beside their lip, they will actually root to find it, the sucking reflex and so on. So we're built with this. In other words, we're pre-wired for certain things. So the brain is not a blank slate, so to speak, right? It's equipped with certain evolutionary programs that are in there. So, and then after that will be, you could see the limbic system or the emotional system of the brain, right? And this is the thing that will tell you everything is actually couched through the fear network. That's why fear is a very powerful emotion, right? It's even being used in politics without people actually knowing that they're being manipulated by that fear response, right?
So
Just
well
because
said.
it's is this dangerous for me or is it not? That's your initial, right? Like, is Eben going to be mean to me or not? So there's that fear response first before you actually shift to others. But that thing is not consciously done. That's vetted within your limbic system automatically, right? There are people that for example, we have an ickiness of snakes. Snake ickiness is part of us, right? And for example,
does that come, sorry, Dr. Ted, not to cut you off because you're on such an awesome roll, but is our sort of primitive or primal fear of snakes, is that some sort of ancient mechanism that's been downloaded through us throughout generations and the evolution of our species?
Yes, and that's called, if you're studying, for example, cognitive psychology on how you make mistakes, right? And we'll go through this later. How you make mistakes. This is called the type 1 error, and it's because of this type of program, right? Type 1 error is a false negative.
Mm.
right? A false positive. Sorry, it's a false
Okay.
positive. If you see a garden hose, that's coiled around, you immediately jump out, and then you see, oh, it's just a garden hose. It's because if you made a false negative type 2 error, you would have been already bitten and dead. So
Mm-hmm.
so your survival and reproduction wiring is wired in there
Uh-huh.
within you, right?
Yeah.
And then after that, uh, your essentially your emotion response, the emotion that actually provides salience, or how important is this signal to me, right?
Mm.
And it's done by emotion. And it's, you could see this even in single-celled organisms, Eben. In single-celled organisms, if you put one in a very acidic environment, it will move away from it, right?
Mm.
It try to find the middle, and this has just been basically codified in our system, right?
Mm.
In our system to do so. And within of course the limbic system, when you're 3D printing it, along with it, you actually put the long-term memory structure, just the hippocampus, right? That's
Ah.
where your long-term memory is stored. So you touch a hot stove as a child, then you reflexly pull it out. There's also learning that's going on that's shoved into your memory system, right?
Mm.
And so many of the previous psychological techniques or psychiatric techniques was to bring out all of this conditioned response that you had, right, in the past. And that's why abuse or trauma during childhood become very important, because they're stored in there, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, you have in the brain, it's like a question mark. You begin from the dot from below,
Ah.
and then you proceed all the way up to the brains. From the brainstem, it curves up, the hippocampus, and then you have your visual system, which is the visual cortex, which is the back of the brain, right? And it's these are now the senses, the senses, seeing, hearing, and so on. And then when those are actually gated. The thalamus, which is a structure in the central part of the brain, they gate all of the senses. It's known as sensory gating. Like, for example,
Mm.
some drugs can act on the thalamus to gate the pain signals that come up to the brain. So, and this senses has to be associated with your conception, right? So you have now things like a percept, the senses as they come into you, and then a concept. So this allows, for example, a child to see a tail of a pony. First he has to see the pony, and then pretty soon there will be a concept of a horse, and he will just see a part of a horse, say the tail, and said, "Oh, that's a horse tail," right?
Mm.
And then everything comes as a refinement of that. Is like, for example, you tell him that a zebra is a black horse with white stripes, and it's not the other way around. So these are the kinds of things. So as you move forward, then the newest portion of the brain, is the forebrain, the one that makes us plan, the one that makes us stay in the future, right?
Mm.
The one that is one we have to train, right? The one we have to train, because otherwise we are always continuously worrying about the future, because we learned some things in the past, right?
Mm.
And so we're always in the past or in the future and never in the present moment.
Yes.
That's why mindfulness or present moment awareness is a skill that people can learn, right?
Mm.
To do that. Or
Yeah.
they can, try, if it's not bad for them. I'm not recommending this to any country where it's illegal, but, they can try some microdosing, some psilocybin, or
Yes.
microdosing some LSD, at least twice a week, to experience what it is, just to have an attenuation,
Mm.
of that system, and an attenuation of the illusion of the self, right?
Mm.
So that you feel, you can make decisions that are not just referential to yourself, right? So that's why, for example, exercise is such a great antidepressant, up to
Yeah.
85% better, right, than antidepressants. It's because when you're exercising, you're not actually focused inward, you're focused outward, right?
Mm.
You're, for example, you're running or walking outside and you're focused outside. You're not ruminating from things inside of you. So you could see how the brain is very young, and most people actually don't realize that although the brain has 86 billion neurons, we only have about 16 billion neurons in the cortex. The cortex is very thin, right? Most
Mm.
of our about that sorry 26 20 but we only have 26 billion neurons in the cortex. Majority, about 60 billion, are actually contained in our cerebellum. The cerebellum is the part of the brain that's at the back right here, the one that you actually bludgeon when you want to murder someone. you know it's it's responsible for movement, right? It's responsible for your movement and so on. So you could see we're 3D printed from the ground up, first by evolution, right? You have it biologically printed, it's there. And then as you get older now, you begin to have your what I call sociocultural programs. And or environmental programs, like, for example, people marvel at how come the baby responds to the mother's voice, etc. Well, when the fetus is inside the body and it begins to hear, the brain begins to get wired and gets used to all of those sounds, right? It begins to hear the quarreling of the parents, for example, and so on. So you could see now that while in utero, the brain already is getting programmed, and then that's when they're born is when we totally fuck them up. Is because
Yeah.
that's when we pass our neurosis to our kids, and the most pernicious ones are our beliefs, right, about things which are useful to us but may not be useful to their generation, right? So from a bottom-up control, we now try to exert a top-down control, but we're so poor at top control, Eben, because the top-down control means we have to now understand what rationality is about, right? And that's why we always say, well, emotion and rationality are different. And that's because rationality is very counterintuitive. And I always tell this to my students, rationality is based on statistics and probability, right? Which is very counterintuitive to us because that's not how we're programmed. And so we make a lot of, we have cognitive biases or heuristics, shortcuts that the brain makes. Like, for example, when you see an illusion, like, for example, you see the Caniza triangle where you see 3 dots with notches, right? And your brain fills in the triangle in the middle. Yeah, that's a Caniza triangle. And triangle does not exist, but your brain fills it in as a shortcut. Right? And so we use those shortcuts, and oftentimes to our detriment. And the self is also a shortcut, and it's oftentimes to our suffering. So it's a shortcut, right? And that, for example, awareness is actually late, right? Awareness of something is late. It's anywhere from 350 seconds to 7 seconds late. And the way I'd like to explain this is, for example, when you are a catcher in baseball, right? Or you're a batter, you're a batter in baseball. So essentially, people have to remember that the world around us is just a representation. It's not reality out there. We're hallucinating this reality, as the neuroscientist Anil Seth likes to say, right? Everything is actually represented in our brain. There is no such thing as the computer in front of me, but rather that's represented in my brain, right? So the reality out there is whatever it is, right? If there is indeed a reality out there, it's whatever it is. But how it is represented in my brain is this way. It's because this is how my senses and my brain function. right?
Mhm.
And the way you look at it is that the way I say this is, if our eyes were seeing UV all the time, what would our art look like? It would be
Mm.
totally different, right?
Yeah.
So people have to remember that. But what I was beginning to say in terms of in terms of the brain being, the awareness being late, like say you are the batter, right?
Mhm.
So the ball is coming at you at whatever speed, and there's wind and whatever, right? It the the brain takes a few seconds to integrate all of those signals from what you're seeing, from what you're hearing, from what cues you're getting from the catcher, if you look back, and so on. And so all of those are delayed. So there's a few milliseconds delay. In fact, my computation was 2 pi seconds. That was back in 1992. And then an Italian group 2 years ago said, it's more about 7 seconds. My paper was entitled, How Long is the Present Moment, right? How long
Mm.
is this present
I'd
moment?
love to read that.
And and therefore, when you bat, that's why you need to practice and practice and practice, because you have to compensate for the error, right?
Yes.
The error of your perception. So that's the reason why you practice, is that you keep on practicing, is to diminish that error, right? Is
Mm.
diminish error between what you're seeing and how your body is moving. And you could see right there that awareness is actually delayed, right? It's late. So the world that we're living in is actually delayed by a few. Our awareness of the world is actually delayed by anywhere from 350 milliseconds to 7 seconds. And there was a work of Libet in 1990, which has been often cited, and some people actually don't like using it, but there he actually saw that he told the subjects to reach for a glass of water when they willed it, right? When they willed, it's like, now I want to reach for that glass of water. And what he found is that at the point of reaching for the glass of water, the brain has already been firing by 350 milliseconds beforehand.
Mm.
So who is that 350 milliseconds beforehand, right?
Yeah.
So you could only imagine then that it's the willful self, right? The illusory self that says, I'm going to reach for the glass of water, but beforehand there is that awareness already that's there, that is not being presented to your consciousness, right?
Mm.
So you can see you can see how we have made a lot of progress in neuroscience. And my one of my missions is, as I said, to decrease suffering in yourself. And one of the ways to do that, and for me, is to decrease suffering in yourself, is to be able to see when yourself is arising. And it's a skill that you acquire, right? By
Yes.
meditation, by use of judicious use of psychedelics, and so on. And just to have a feel, I call it the steroids. Psychedelics are the steroids
Yes.
of the mental gym, right?
Yes, for
they're,
sure.
they're the steroids of the mental gym. You still have to do the work, you still have to
Yes,
do the heavy lifting. So
definitely.
in order to grow in order to grow. So if we can so if you're looking at it that way, right, then you could look at the 2500-year-old writings of the Buddha, for
Mm.
example,
Mm-hmm.
and so on, and it's essentially arriving at the same conclusion,
Yeah.
except that it is now we have neuroscience to show that, well, okay, the ego has its purpose, or the self-referential system has its purpose, right?
What
um,
is that
and
purpose?
from the purpose is for you to be able to attach your role to it. For example, there's
Uh-huh.
Dr. Ted as a doctor, and there's Dr. Ted as a teacher, and there's Dr. Ted as an interviewee, and so on.
So
And
it's like a
and
reference point.
it's a reference point, but have to know that these are just roles.
Uh-huh.
It's not you,
Right,
right?
right.
There is no you there. It's just a role. But
Uh-huh.
people see you as that. People see you as that. And I've heard you listen to Alan Watts and so on. It's like, well, one of the people that you should listen to also is Ramdas, right?
Yeah,
He
love
says
Ram.
a lot of this. Yeah, he says a lot of these things um, in his own way. But had he survived, I know he died last December, but had he survived, and seen all of these developments in neuroscience, he would have essentially married. He's very brilliant. He
Yeah.
married,
Yeah.
the current neuroscience with it. So for those who are not interested in Ramdas, those who are not interested in Alan Watts or anything like that, I encourage them and to stick to the science of it if they're not comfortable with the philosophy, right?
Yeah.
And say, how do we now use this to help ourselves? So why is this an emergency of our time? I know we started this, Eben, in our pre-interview talk, and it's because when we suffer this way, right? It's the ego that always wants. I want this, I want that, I want that. My example is that if you teach your kids, I want a $3,000 prom dress, you fuck 'em up, right? So, right? And so, what is it then? On a collective view, right? Then we want more profits, right? Because we want more profits, we are going to pollute the earth more, which is the only habitat that we have right now. We will use child labor, we will do slave trade, and so on. So you could see that from just that fundamental seed, right?
Yes.
That fundamental seed of not realizing that egoic self is not identity, right? When you assume that the egoic self is your identity, that now you see the mushrooming of all of the problems that we have currently. And what's frustrating me is that now we have really these weird times of the pandemic, and what we're seeing is people fighting, right? People fighting instead of banding together and saying, well, what do we do for our species now, right?
Yes.
Where are we in our place with all the other species on Earth, right? And for me, I like to say this in my lectures: humans are not the most important species on Earth; they're just the most pernicious, and and they are pernicious because of this identification self-preferential system, right? It is not bad. It's just you need to have a balance, and you need to know when the illusion is there, right? Oh, you're seeing an illusion, and then when you're seeing the illusion, you're able to pull back and said, oh, I'm getting hurt from this conversation because someone is owning the emotion, right? I'm getting hurt from this. I'm suffering from this pain because someone is owning the pain, right? So that's why people say, I say, like, even in the worst headache that you're having, yeah, you have pain, but you're not suffering, because when you are looking at non-ownership of the pain, it's just there. It's actually a mechanism of your body to warn you of something that is not good, right? For pain, like you cut yourself and so on. This is basically a body's warning for you. It's just pain, right? And there's no owner to pain. It's like, it's not doctor that is hurting, there's just pain. And all the writings in the East, are written just so, because that's exactly the experience that they have, right? It's written on like, this is the experience. If you, for example, have tried headless.org, the headless way, where how do you really see the world, right? And the world without your face, without anything, right? And everything is just in front of you. So when you make that switch, right? When you realize like, yeah, your first person view of the world really contains no head. You just see until your body and so on, but the whole of you contains all of the world around you. And this is the shift, that make. In fact, one of you know, Wolfast, I use one of Sam Harris's examples here as, how superficial this illusion is. It's not a deep one as people make it to be. It's
Right.
actually what's called the ordinary mind, right? It's the ordinary mind. And you shift to that ordinary mind. It says it's like riding on a train. All our lives are actually focused on the outside, right? We're focused on the side, what's happening on the side, etc. But every once in a while, with the proper lighting and the proper angle of the face, you catch a glimpse of that face in the glass, and it's yours, right? And that brief moment, that's the loss of the ego, right? It's just a few seconds that you glimpse it because of the of that. And the goal is, well, how do you now prolong the experience, right? How do you stay you can see both outside and your face at the same time, meaning you can see the reflection of your ego arise. That's not you either, right? So it's a good example, analogy of how superficial really the illusion is. People think it's deep because of the practices of having to go deep into meditation, etc., going into vipassana retreats, or 6-week meditation, etc. That is good, and you know why that's good, is that it's training you actually to have absolutely no disturbance and to stick there and take a look at how your thought actually occurring. One of the big lessons is to see your thoughts occurring in the same space as your emotions, is occurring in the same space as right now I'm looking at you via a Zoom screen, is occurring into what I'm hearing and hearing you. So it's all one space of consciousness. There is no boundary between inside and outside, and they're just arising. But what the self-referential system does is it sort of like binds them together and says, this is me. This is what I'm hearing. This is what I am seeing. And so on. So, but if you know that, if you train yourself and saying, okay, that's an illusion that's necessary for this role, that after you exert the role, you can return back to not having to use the self at all, right? When you're working throughout the day, you don't need the self there saying, I own this project. You just do things, right? And for me, one of the things that, for example, meditation and mindfulness are two different things, right? And mindfulness is basically focusing you on what you're doing at the present moment. What that's doing is really taking you out of your default mode and into your central executive and saying you're totally aware now. And since they're counter switched, right, your self or sense of will totally decrease, right? And so, this is one of the things when I was formulating, for example, the blue carnitine, right? The turkey that you bought to improve focus, right? It has methylene blue, which energizes the neurons. It has caffeine to wake you up. It has some nicotine for your memory, right? And it has CBD, to remove the sharp feeling that you get from caffeine and nicotine. And although we do it for focus, one of the things that I wanted to see, I formulated it for myself, right? Is that, can I go on an external focus here without involving my default mode network? So what it does is it forces you to focus outwards on your work, on the things that need to get done, or as our followers say, on the shit that needs to get done, right? You just do them. And what that does is, when you're focused outwards, it's automatically your self gets shut off, right? So we're looking at this now so how can we do this, if to the younger generation, for example? How can we teach them this skill? And they seem to be steeped in a lot of things that it's still in the old teachings, right? It's still in the old teachings, and so on. It's like, no. We now have sufficient neuroscience. It's incomplete, right? And it will always be incomplete. We now have sufficient neuroscience to be able to make ourselves suffer less. And in the process of making ourselves suffer less, other people will suffer less. And because other people suffer less, then the world suffers less, right? So it's a chain, and that's why it's an emergency. That's why where I'm pushing is actually to the neuroscience of things, rather than to the metaphysics of things, and so on. Although it's lovely because, the metaphysics of things or the philosophy of things can rapidly push the emotional circuits or your limbic system, right, into action. That's why sayings have a lot of power with them, because they pull in your good feelings about something, right?
Yes.
You pull in about good feelings about something. But the thing that I like to tell people is that it's not about feeling something, right? For me, it's all about not feeling something, which is not feeling the suffering. So those are two separate things. I like to say in my lectures also, even that Eben's rather, sorry,
Oh, good,
that
man.
we evolved to survive and reproduce. So we
Yes.
are wired to survive and reproduce. We are not wired for happiness. So happiness is a fucking inside job. So,
I love that, man.
and it comes because there are only about 26 billion neurons in the cortex, right? Which is very thin, and most people don't realize that. So its power is actually not in the number of neurons, but in the number of connections that the neurons make, right? So how can we train these connections, right, in order for us to be able to see when the brain is using its illusions, right? When it's using the illusion, when we take a look at the illusion, for example, of when we see the illusion of a vase, there's a vase, and then when you take a look at it, oh, it's actually two faces facing each other, right? These kinds of illusions.
Yes.
The brain does the same thing with the egoic self, right? It's just that it's so superficial to us, right? It's so superficial to us that we don't realize it. We don't realize that it's already formed the illusion. So when you're doing mindfulness, meditation, etc., we know that there's already a neuroscientific basis for that, right? So me, I'm the impatient sort, right? I'm the impatient sort. I like the 10-cent solution. You know the 10-cent solution story, right? Of the Buddha
I
and the
don't, but
guru.
it sounds familiar.
Yeah, the
I
Buddha
think
and the guru.
everybody's looking for the 10-cent solution.
Yeah, the Buddha and the guru were walking on the bank of Enlightenment River.
I love
And
it.
in the middle of Enlightenment River was Enlightenment Island. And the guru said to the Buddha, Buddha, I studied for 30 years on Levitation Island. Now I can just walk on water and reach the Enlightenment Island. And the Buddha said, 30 years? My God, that is so long. Why did you do that? The ferry to Enlightenment Island costs only 10 cents.
I love that. I love that.
So
That's so
actually,
good.
that's my version. The original one was in a book by Conway about Buddhism, right? But anyway, so what are these 10-cent solutions? Well, we already have seen a few of them. Some of them are mindfulness apps, your meditation apps, and then you have headbands, like Muse and meditation bands that monitor your EEG and so on. And you could see people making a big deal about what the brain waves are doing, because, for example, monks meditate, they have lots more of the gamma bursts in their brain, which is, 40 hertz is known as the synchronizing burst of the brain. It synchronizes the activities of the brain, right? And and so on. So there's a history that we're building on to produce 10-cent solutions, right? And I'm just happy that there's a renaissance of psychedelics,
Yeah.
because then the 10-cent solutions are being studied. How, what do they actually do? How do they last? And what sort? We already know that studies on psilocybin, it's ranked as one of the top 5 most important experiences in someone's life, according to the study in Hopkins. So these are the kinds of things that we keep tabs on, right? And it assumes a lot of importance in our lives, especially now. It assumes a lot of importance in our lives because we see ourselves and other people suffering, right? And most of the time, we actually are not aware that the suffering is actually coming from within us, and we can inflict this same suffering on others.
Yes.
If we're not aware, right?
Yes.
So but there's also the pitfall of using this. And my example was that of a coach, who used a life coach who used psychedelics. He gave like a microdose LSD to CEOs, and then they would walk the forests of California, and they would go, "Oh, okay. So how do I increase my profits this year?" Right?
Yeah.
So it's
yeah.
So it's more like that, rather than looking like, for example, the example of the gentleman who actually essentially gave his employees a minimum wage of 70,000 a year, because that was a study, that at the time that he did it, that was a study where any more than that and it doesn't increase your happiness anymore. I think the value is now 80,000. But and he slashed his salary from 1.1 million in order to accommodate that. And but CEOs who see that, and they've tripled their business and they're very successful because of that, etc. And CEOs who say nope, not going to do that.
Not doing that.
Yeah, not doing that. And that's how that's I don't blame them in a sense that's because that's how we're programmed, right? We're programmed to survive and reproduce, and therefore greed and fear, which is what rules the markets, right? Greed and fear are actually wired in us, right? They're wired in us. So for me, then, and I like to say this, is that what then does it mean to be human? Right? What does it mean to be human? So what it means for me is then to be able to go against the grain of these bioevolutionary programs, right? Be able to, like, so now, for example, we have the Americans for Disabilities Act, or what we're looking at have issues that are very contentious to our times, really hearken to our bioevolutionary programs for survival and reproduction. For example, we don't allow euthanasia, right? And because that goes against the survival and reproduction. So how can we go against this, in an educated way, right? We know that thousands of children in the Palatia are starving, right? And and yet and yet we are drinking our $6 lattes, right? So there's this kind of thing that's within us, that's really wired in us, right? So how do we counter that? So we come with creative solutions, and with that, we have to transcend. We have to go to our rational minds, and it's very difficult to get to the rational mind because it's often counterintuitive. Like, for example, Charles Darwin's theory on evolution, right? is very counterintuitive, right? It's for him, it's like, well, we have random variation in our genes, and then it's actually the environment that selects for us. And it's actually very interesting that we commit, for example, called a fundamental attribution error, right? We attribute something like to the CEO who tripled the whatever of the company in a year, not realizing that the tide was rising economically anyway, and we attribute very little to the environment they're in. So we make these mistakes, right? We're attributing to the disposition of the person rather to the environment to which the leader was actually operating in. And the funny way that I really bring this home is, I love Nassim Taleb's, full randomness book. He was also the author of Black Swan.
Yeah.
Is more like a turkey is led to believe every day, "Lo, he likes me, he really likes me," and then Thanksgiving comes up and then he gets beheaded. And we're like that in the markets, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, but in full by randomness, there's actually a story there. It's like, okay, I have 100 leaders now, right? Or 100 basketball players, or and so on. And you tell them, okay, every year I'm only going to get the best and the brightest among you. I'll cut you down by 50%. But what they don't know is you're simply flipping a coin. You really don't look at their credentials, you're just flipping a coin. So the first year, you have 50, the second year you have 25, the third year you have 12.5, and so on. By the seventh year, the guy who is there says, "I got here from sheer hard work. I wake up at 4 o'clock every morning, blah blah blah." And you go, "Dude, I was only flipping the coin."
Yeah.
We get fooled by randomness a lot of the time, right? And because that's how we're wired, right? We have what's called a panicity bias. We tend to see patterns. That's why we see faces in clouds and so on. And that's why there are a lot of conspiracy theories around, because we like to see, pedophiles in pizza shops. I'm sorry. But but that's the programming, right? So it behooves us to actually study how are we programmed. That's why I discussed the development of the brain. It's like a question mark going from the bottom, from towards the front of the brain, because that's how we're wired. And what is wired in there, the bioevolutionary programs and all of their shortcuts, they're called heuristics, right? How we make decisions, right? Because things like, for example, if you an example that I can give is like, I'll tell you, okay, Eben, which treatment would you choose? This drug that will make 90 people survive, or 90% of the people survive, or this drug that will kill 10% of people. What will your answer be?
The drug that saves 90% of the people who take it.
Yes, but they're the same, right? 10% death and 90% alive. We choose the alive, but they are the same. And this is how I say that we should teach these kinds of things earlier, like grade school, so that rationality, it's people, for example, people vote, people do things by their emotion, right? But what we need to teach is to stop and say, okay, to look at their emotions because of their training, meditation, and mindfulness, right? To look at their emotions and to look at who, if there's a who in there, that the self or the ego is up, at who is getting angry or who is making a decision, and then operate the rational part of the brain and say, okay, I recognize now that this is the program that's running, and they're actually equal. these two choices are actually equal. And that's when you begin to push counterintuitive things like rationality, etc. And until we're able to do that, and it's hard to train this, right? It's hard to train your brain to think rationally. And the markets are, it's been proven, the markets are never rational. For example, the stock market never is. So and I know that because I traded currencies using artificial intelligence for 5 years. So so when you now realize these things, then see how what are the steps we can do moving forward, right? For me, it's always like for example, when I created health optimization medicine and practice, right? That's a practice that detects and corrects imbalances in your metabolites inside your cell. I said, well, illness medicine is about diagnosis and treatment of disease. So health optimization medicine is about the detection and correction of your balances inside the cell. So when we're looking at things like this, it requires a shift in perspective. And the shift in perspective, for example, give is illness medicine, you're looking at a person as a part of a population, right? So your antibiotic has to work within the population. Your surgery has to work in the population. But health is not that way. And I know you believe this, that health is a highly individualized thing. You need something that's tailored for you. So the shift that you need to make is to shift to looking the body as an ecosystem in itself, right? Whereas you used to look at the person as part of an ecosystem. Now the shift that you need to make in perspective is to look at the body as an ecosystem in itself. It's like a jungle that needs to balance itself. Right? And so now you're very familiar with, for example, autonomic balance. Like, for example, people in chronic stress have very high sympathetic tone, right? They're always nervous, they're always worried, they're always ready to punch people in the face, and so on, right? There's a very high sympathetic tone. And what meditation does to you is make you identify, that kind of activation, and so you could balance it out. So it's part of, in health meditation, we're only about balancing those things. And the twist that I put in there is that you put it at a younger age when it was optimal for you, right? For example, you balance hormones, nutrients, and micronutrients and macronutrients according to when you were optimal, which is when you were between 21 and 30 years old, right? They're a network. Like, for example, if you give someone too much zinc in the winter when you're trying to prevent cold, you're going to spill out their copper. So the body has this kind of balance. So when you give someone, people, for example, men who take arginine so they can have better boners, it's a nitric oxide precursor. So,
I know.
So they try to they begin to get cursors, right? Canker sores, right? And that's because you're
imbalances the lysine.
The lysine, So the body does a lot of balancing, and it's in a network. You cannot just touch one and expect that things will go well. And that's my quarrel, right? When you just give a man a testosterone. No, you don't give a man testosterone. You balance everything else: growth hormone, thyroid hormone, thymus gland, the pancreas, the adrenals, and then the gonads. At least those major centers, right? So
awesome.
Now you see you see the body as a network.
Absolutely.
As a network, as is basically its own ecosystem. So looking at that, it's that kind of perspective shift is needed, right? We need that kind of shift, and that shift in perspective is really all that we're doing when we're recognizing, right? When we're recognizing the illusoriness of the self. You just for people, it occurs in brief moments, right? That there are where they realize that the self doesn't exist, and to give them a longer experience of that, you give them fucking 5 grams of mushrooms, and
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
you know, well, which is what Hopkins does, right? He's supervised,
Right.
highly
Right.
supervised. So that's where I am. You know, we are highly connected within ourselves. We're connected to our microbiota. We're connected to everything because it's all part of us. So when you start looking at the body as an ecosystem itself, then suddenly the gut microbes that you have or the skin microbes are part of you. They're no longer outside of you, right?
Yeah.
They're part of you that you should take care of. You know, that you should take care of by eating a high fiber diet, etc. And then now, you know, there's for example, Russo. We have, we know that we have an endocannabinoid system,
Yes.
and he has proposed the existence of endocannabinoid imbalance, right? The endocannabinoid imbalance, which he says it can be remedied not just by cannabis alone. You know, it can be remedied by exercise, proper diet, and so on. He's not dogmatic about saying no, you should take cannabis.
You're talking about
But there
Dr.
is some,
Ethan Russo?
yeah,
Yes.
right. And he was the one. The thing is, the endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome is a theory that he has, right? And you really need to have both. You need to have theory and the data. And the data that he has shown would be, you know, why is, for example, migraine, chronic fatigue, and one more. There's one more disease. It was a triad. Why are they always linked together in pain, right? And so he that's his data, right? And then it gets relieved by exogenous cannabinoids, and you know, I've had clients in California. I don't call them patients because they're not sick. I have clients in California who have benefited from this therapy because they have both migraines and chronic fatigue syndrome, right? So you have the theory, and then the data that's following it up, but then it's being misconstrued by wellness medicine people. You know, no such thing exists, etc., etc. It's hard to, but that's missing the point. You know, because you're look at that point from that viewpoint. Again, this is perspective, right? You're looking at cannabis as drug for treatment versus cannabis for health, for relief of signs and symptoms, right?
Yes.
So then you could see then that much of the fights that we're having are actually fights in the difference in perspective, right? You're looking at it in the traditional way. This is cannabis is a drug. And then you look at it now, cannabis for health, it's just for balancing. So what are we balancing? Well, the theory is we have an endocannabinoid system. We have an endocannabinoid deficiency. But one of the things, Evan, that's actually funny is that I had migraine one time, and a friend of mine, I never had migraine after I started balancing myself with hormones, right? And then one time I was just massively jet lagged, and I had to push myself for work here because work among politicians here in DC is quite demanding with grumpy old men, right?
I'm sure.
So for the first time in my life, you know, took one hitter. You know, I say Clinton was right. He said I didn't inhale because he just had edibles, man. So I could always say, you know, I've never inhaled, and that was the first time. You know, he said, "Here, Ted, take this. It's more rapid," and I took it. And man, it was a psychedelic experience. Just one hit, and it was a psychedelic experience. The music had you know, the words that were being said had a three-dimensional state to them that are being passed back and forth. And this is not, you know, this is not typical, right? This is not typical. That it's very psychedelic. And my friend said, "Ted, you better get over this. You're going to be a cheap date." And then and then and then it was so psychedelic for me, and it lasted for about 3 hours, right?
Mm.
And then after 3 hours, of course, the migraine came back. but
Mm.
but then uh you know, I took a look at my genetic code, right? And why is it that every time that was the first time, and then there was a second time, and I experienced the same thing? And I said, "What that this happens to me?" And it turns out, there were genes in there that could probably be triggered and induce cannabinoid-induced schizophrenia, and that's just
Interesting.
for me
Yeah.
as a
Yeah.
gene. So I took so I was putting together, and this is now very personal to me. I started putting things together. Achacoso in Spanish is really has a very bad meaning. It means decrepit old man, right? And
Oh
when
God.
people when people know the meaning, they go, oh, and they laugh, right? The Spanish people, they laugh, and I said that's why I became a doctor. From a younger age, I always had a lot of these aches and pains. That's which I thought it was normal for people to have aches and pains, right? And probably this is the reason why I have my last name, right?
Mm.
Because of all of these complaints. And then my hypothesis is this: my endocannabinoid balance is probably, when my endocannabinoid tone is very probably low, uh, and therefore I have lots of these aches and pains, right?
Mm.
In order to prevent me from becoming schizophrenic, right?
Mm.
If my endocannabinoid tone were higher, then I probably would be schizophrenic. Well, sometimes I am, but
Interesting.
the yeah. So it's just n equal to 1 observation,
On
right? That
that,
perhaps, yeah.
no, on that note, because this is something that's very fascinating to me, Dr. Ted. I mean, you're fucking blowing my mind, brother. I'm so happy to have had you on here. Um, so on the idea of schizophrenia, are you familiar with Yogi Bhajan? Yogi
Mm-mm.
Bhajan came to America, and he was one of the early emissaries, to use that word again, of yoga and meditation in America. And he came over here in the
Mm-hmm.
60s to teach the young hippies, particularly starting, I think, at Woodstock, about the power of yoga and meditation. And
Mm-hmm.
during this time, the American medical establishment had started experimenting or practicing lobotomies on people who were schizophrenic. But Yogi Bhajan said, stop doing these lobotomies, send them to me, I'll teach them how to meditate, because schizophrenics and heavy meditators both suffer from or are gifted with hyperactive or overly active pineal glands. So I'm curious if schizophrenia, from a neuroscience perspective, is perhaps some sort of, gift and curse in that way of a hyperactive center of the brain. And in that, what is the role of the pineal gland in the brain?
Okay. Let me put it this way. In a cultural context, there are cultures out there with shamans, right, in the
Yes.
group. And they identify kids with the gift, right,
Hmm.
early on. And they turn out to be actually potential schizophrenic, right?
Interesting.
And the shamans teach the kids, be they boy or girl, they teach them, okay, you can see that, the rest of the tribe won't be able to see that. So
Mm.
they get guided early,
Mm-hmm.
right? They get guided early because they can see things that other people can't. And so they grow up knowing how to differentiate what other people can see and what only they can see. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So when we take a look at that from a neuroscientific perspective, then we can postulate that they probably are um, overproducing dimethyltryptamine, right? DMT.
Okay.
Which is endogenous to us. The lung produces DMT. At night when we dream, we produce DMT. When our
Interesting.
life flashes before our eyes, before we die, we produce loads of DMT, right? And
Yeah.
when you've taken an ayahuasca journey, or in my case, my ayahuasca journey, um, the pharmawaska journey without vomiting. I can't stand vomiting, man. As I said, I don't like to suffer, so no vomiting for me.
Yeah, it's all good, man.
So it's probably an abundance of that, right? You've heard of you've seen of the painter online, right? With a tumor that produces an abundance of DMT, and the paintings are very visionary, right?
Yes.
It's what you see when you are in a DMT journey. And so you can postulate several things about that. One is that they're producing a lot more DMT than usual. That's why, for example, painters and other artists, who are visually more visual artists or schizophrenic, they don't like taking their drugs because it gets suppressed, right? But there are other theories of schizophrenia, right? One big candidate, of course, is a miswiring of the brain, right? You mistake other things for other things. The other thing is also an overproduction of dopamine, right? Of the dopamine system, and of course, the one is an overproduction of DMT, and dimethyltryptamine is actually a metabolite in the brain, and it's within the pathway of the production of melatonin, right? The hormone melatonin is a hormone that signals your body to rest. Again, I want to correct people's impression. Melatonin will not put you to sleep. Melatonin will only signal your body to rest, right? So, it's within that melatonin pathway that DMT is produced. Now, we really don't know the purpose of the DMT is, right? But it does, when you take a lot of it, as in an ayahuasca or pharmawaska journey, you see that it seems to, on a first-person experience, it seems to open a portal to another dimension for you to experience things. And for me, it's something like, okay, if you want to keep it in a scientific basis, well, the molecule actually makes your brain, quote unquote, vibrate into its specific pathways that gives you that kind of an open experience, right? Because eventually the hope is that it kills your ego, right? It essentially just dampens the whole illusion, that the illusion isn't there for quite a while. So the pineal gland, as we get older, actually, where the melatonin is produced, pituitary is anterior of the brain, pineal is the back of the brain, they calcify, right? And calcification is actually part of a normal process, but we exaggerate it by having too much fluoride, for example, in water, right? My sister's a dentist, and essentially she says, well, you can brush your teeth with fluoridated toothpaste, but make sure you just rinse it all out, right? And before, because we're poorly informed, right, that we fluoridated the water too much, and fluoridated water is actually just meant for you to gargle and rinse your mouth with. You really don't want to drink it. So the production of melatonin then is mostly pituitary, but it's in the lower, right? It's shaped like a pineapple, right? Which you will see in the Pope's scepter and
ancient
and so
iconography,
on, right?
etc.
Yes, and so on and so forth. So because it means, right, pine cone, pineal.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's the importance of that. And in one lecture of mine, a psychiatrist who has taken over hundreds of ayahuasca journey says,
Mm.
how do you incorporate into your health optimization, medicine, and practice model, spirituality?
Mm.
And I said, in keeping with imbalance, I said, well, that's just spell imbalance, right? So the spirit molecule is DMT. So you just give them DMT, problem solved, right?
I love that, man. I
So
love
it's
that.
I call it the DMT deficiency syndrome. If you lack
The world,
spirituality,
the world has that.
yes, yes. uh, so it's, and people often misconstrue, and this is the thing, is that I like defining things, right?
Mm.
You have to define things like, what is happiness for you? People say, I want to be happy, but what is that? Right?
Yeah.
So you have to
Yeah.
be, for me, happiness is equanimity, right?
Mm.
That's what I mean by happiness. Not being too happy when things are really going great, and not being too sad when things are not great. It's just these small waves rather than
Yes.
tidal waves of joy and deep whirlpools of sadness. I don't like that, right?
Yeah.
But for people, that for other people, that works for them because they're addicted to that feeling, right? They've
Yeah.
addicted to the feeling of deep sadness, addicted to the feeling of deep joy. But when you're looking at spirituality, what does spirituality mean?
Mm.
You know,
Yes.
for you, what does spirituality mean,
Well,
and how separate is it from religion? What is the difference between spirituality and religion, right?
mm-hmm.
And how do you separate all of those different concepts?
Yeah. Well, I
So
think I think that exact thing is part of the greater issue, particularly in the West. And perhaps you can correct me on this, but it feels like a very westernized concept of compartmentalization of everything. Our church, if you want spirituality, you go to the church. If you want to work out, you go to the gym, and everything is out there and it's in a certain place. And like you said, it discounts this greater understanding that it's all one thing and it's all contained in this grand experience that we call life. And for many Americans in particular, and seeing all of this divisiveness of, how do you believe that? I believe this. This is what's right. This is what's true. If you're on that side of the line, you're doing it wrong. Um, and in this greater emergency of, I call it a spiritual and emotional crisis, because we have been so steeped in our materialism and our consumerdom and this idea of, I'll be happy when XYZ happens, or I'll be happy when I achieve this. And coming back to your earlier point of, and you said this in another podcast, and I wanted to hit this with you. And you said this earlier on. I mean, you've just been on fire, Dr. Ted. It's so awesome for you to just get on your roll. But this idea of enlightenment being this place you attain where your pain is no longer there, or your thoughts, you have control over your thoughts. And rather than having that perspective, shifting your perspective to the observer and being the witness of your life and allowing thoughts. And it goes to everything you've said. Like, if we can get out of this idea of trying to control everything that's around us and it happening in our heads, and we just allow these things to happen and move through us, we'll achieve that sustained happiness or inner sense of joy and peace. What do you think about that, dude?
um, that's why I am pushing for people to be aware of their two sets of programming.
Mm-hmm.
How are you programmed by biology and evolution,
Yes.
so that you're able to identify those arise, right?
Mm.
Um, and the second is, how are you programmed by your society and your culture, including that of your family, right?
Mm.
Like,
Yeah.
what is in you, for example, your attitude, say, uh, that's due to the programming of society and culture. There in society and culture, embedded in there are things that you value, and you have to check those. Is this what I really value? A lot more money, a lot more of this, um, uh, at the expense of my health, at the expense of my family, at the expense of not spending time with people I love. So whose values are that? Are those your father's? Is that the programming that was instilled to you by your father, by your mother, by your parents? What were their expectations? And then you jettison them, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's what we
Yes.
encourage young adults, when you're 21, 22 years old, go around and travel the world and quote unquote, go find yourself. And go finding
Yeah,
yourself is
yeah.
actually finding yourself inside you all along, right?
Yes, exactly.
And the reason for going outside is going outside of your family and your environment, right? Because as I said, we often have this fundamental attribution error that it is us, right? Our predisposition, etc. But when you take a look at the big picture, the context, you take yourself out of the context, and you'll be able to identify things a little better. So even just those two, they're big exercises. I still do them. They're lifetime exercises on identifying, for example, in terms of your bioevolutionary programs, identifying your cognitive biases. In terms of sociocultural programs, what's you determine what's culturally appropriate, culturally appropriate behavior for you, in terms of how you relate with other people. For example, the first time I worked in Asia 30 days every quarter, except for during this time of the pandemic. Temporary grounded here. But the first time I worked there 11 years ago, I held a meeting, and I was pulled aside by the owner of the company. Said, you made two of my people cry. And I didn't even know that I did that. And I realized, like, oh, this is a different culture. This is an Asian culture where you have to be indirect all the time. And I was being American, just bulldozing the whole thing, because again, I was focused on the project, right? I wasn't focused on the people. So knowing these are simple steps that you can do. I mean, all the information is out there, right? To do that. um, you know know thyself. It's a it's a very, very useful old adage. And from there you can build on, right? You can build on a lot of these things, and know that and I like to say this to the students that I teach. The only thing, uh, the only valuable thing that a mentor can really give his students, or his mentees, is perspective. The rest you can read on internet.
Yeah. No doubt.
Perspective, like for example, having an evolutionary perspective towards health, Eben, important. Uh, how did we get to be this way? Why are we
Yes.
predisposed to certain diseases, and why aren't we predisposed to certain diseases? What our body used to more Paleolithic prescription, right? Rather than what we have right now. This is the make and model in evolution, and so on. If you take a look at how we evolved, then you could see that if I can give that to a perspective to my students, then they're able to reason out very quickly. An example of this is, for example, when I used to take residents on rounds in the hospital, I'll ask them, so why are you oxygenating the patient? They will say, to raise the arterial PO2. Why do you want to raise the arterial PO2? So the brain will work and the heart will work. It's like, so why do you want to raise oxygen in the brain or in the heart? And no one actually goes to the fundamentals again of how we're built, right?
Mm.
It's like, because oxygen is the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain of the mitochondria, which itself is a bacterium that lives inside a cell, right? So you can reason out a lot of these things just by doing that. And the more difficult part is actually that we know that we have to exert a lot of things on our bottom-up impulses, right? I want to punch you now, but our top-down or our rational part says, okay, no, I'm not gonna punch you now. Because there is such a thing called diplomacy that we learned, and so on and so forth. So you could see how we are still bereft of the control of a pure rational control, and probably we never can. All we can do is achieve a balance between the two, right?
Yeah.
You know when it is that you need to be angry to make a point, and when it is to pull back, right? So these are the kinds of things that we're still learning about ourselves. We leave everything. I like to leave things open-ended. For example, like questions like the nature of the universe, and I actually tell people, who say, what's the purpose of my life, and why am I here, and
yeah.
and I go, those are useless questions. They will just fucking get you depressed. Stop asking them. It's not gonna make you any better person, right? It's poorly framed, right? The questions are poorly framed. There are no answers to those questions. So this is what is for me. In January, I think I don't know whether I told this to Luke, but at 11:30 at night, I had a sudden laughing fit, right? Like a sudden laughing fit, where it hit me in the gut that life is purposeless and meaningless, right? Life is purposeless and meaningless. And I was laughing my head off because I'm prone to depression. I already tried to commit to myself once. So, and then because of the depression that goes with existential angst, right? I used to get depressed by that issue. And then just realizing that I was laughing for 24 hours. I even had to call a friend of mine who was a doctor. I said, do I need to inject myself with an antipsychotic? But it was so funny, right? It was so totally funny.
The cosmic joke.
That, yeah, it was a totally big cosmic joke. And so not to disturb the neighbors, I ran to my kitchen. And then right there is like a complete dissolution of the ego, right? The kitchen cabinets and I were one and the same thing. So it was so terribly funny. And then I had this, it's just an experience, right? And you don't need these experiences for these quote unquote enlightenment experiences,
right?
It's not necessary, but it just happened to me, and I saw this like suddenly there was as if there was this screen in front of me that was playing my life, right? Playing my life, and someone turned the lights on. And I was like, holy fuck, I was just watching myself in a movie. And
wow.
it was like, and then suddenly, the screen started to descend. And in there were all the illusions that was my life. And I found it hilarious.
That's so profound, man.
Yeah, before I slept that night, I said, I'm not going to medicate myself to sleep. So, because if it's the ego said, I want more of this experience.
Yeah,
right?
of course.
But I found myself just laughing the whole night.
It's
right? Laughing the
beautiful,
whole
man.
night and the next day. But just to tell people, you don't need this kind of quote unquote enlightenment experience, because in Dzogchen, where I'm trained at, this is called the ordinary mind, right?
Mm,
The mind without the self referential system is called the ordinary mind, right?
mm,
So I tell them this is not a super mind. This is like just really going back to the ordinary mind and
mm.
training yourself to get back to the ordinary mind that has been cluttered by
Yes,
all the sociocultural programs that are in there, right?
Dr. Ted.
So
That's so, I mean, it's awesome, man. It's everything I'm tapped into these days is everything you're saying. It's so cool to hear you talk about it so eloquently and so in such a deep analytical way. Are you familiar with Sadhguru?
yeah, I've seen a few of his videos
So
on
he's
the
very much
internet.
on that in that wavelength of, if you talk to him about how do you attain enlightenment, or what are the steps to improving myself to get to this place of self-actualization, he would laugh at you and say that there is no improving yourself. Everything you have and everything you are and everything you need is right here in front of you, within you right now. And so I totally vibe with that. That being said, though, I do believe, like you said, it's about decluttering and cleansing yourself of all of that sociocultural programming that we've been put under since we were little kids. And
Yeah,
so
a friend of mine said to me once, enlightenment is exactly what it means, to lighter. So it's not something that you add; it's something
right.
that you subtract to make you lighter. It's
Mm,
something that you remove, right, to make you
mm,
lighter. So
that's
uh,
it, man. That's it right there.
the so the decluttering is actually getting lighter, but and something to make you really lighter is to see that the self is also the self-referential system is also there, that makes things heavy, right? So
Uh,
when you shatter the illusion, or at least when you recognize that the illusion is at play, then it makes things a lot lighter and easier for you. Oh, it's just an illusion of the
dude,
self, right?
dude, that's the place to end right there. Dr. Ted, I can't thank you enough for your time, man. I really appreciate it. An amazing knowledge and wisdom and insight there in that hour and a half. I can't thank you enough. And I'd love to have you on again, Dr. Ted, if to talk about some other stuff, because I don't know, I don't know how much you know about me, but I played pro football in the NFL, and coming out of my experience, I've very organically fell into cannabis advocacy and getting the NFL to remove cannabis from its banned substance list, because cannabinoids present one of the few, if not the only, remedies to concussions and brain trauma and this thing that NFL players suffer from called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, which I'd love to get your neuroscience take on that at some point as well. Um,
Sure.
and
I just to whet your appetite. It was journey. I was at a conference room one time, and there were doctors. We were having a different meeting, and then they rushed an MRI of
mm,
something, and that being my specialty, right? I looked and I said, "Oh my God!" I said that has a lot of micro infarcts in the, and then the neurologist said, okay, the press release is that, the MRI scan is normal. And I said, whose is that? It turns out to be some boxer's MRI.
uh-huh.
Anyway,
Yes,
just,
yes. No, and I'd love to dive. I mean, that's a whole other podcast. I'd love to dive into that with you. Um, but we'll do that next time, man.
definitely.
And I will be sure to, I record a little introduction that'll go at the beginning of this episode, and I'll be sure to let everybody know where they can find you and all your information. But if you want to just let them know right now before I take us out, go ahead and do that.
Sure. For health optimization, medicine, and practice, you can go to homehope.org. So that's home and then HOPE.org. And then for prescriptions for the blue carnitine focusing troche, that's a transcriptions.com. That's like prescriptions, but with a TRO.
Yeah.
And then if you are in Asia, I'm in Manila 30 days every quarter. That's at biobalanceinstitute.com.
Amazing. Amazing. Dr. Ted, thank you so much, man. I really appreciate
Thank
it.
you, Eben.
And hey, everybody, thank you guys so much for joining me in this episode of the Ebb and Flow podcast. I hope you guys got as much out of that as I did. That was enlightening, to say the least. And greatly appreciate Dr. Ted's time. So until next time, everybody, lots of love, stay positive, stay strong, stay mindful, practice your meditation, start observing those thoughts. It'll do you wonders. So lots of love to you guys. Until next time, I'm Eben Britton, and we're out of here. Peace.